your Naval Academy. You graduated from the Naval Academy in 1958,
right?
Almost 60 years ago. And I think the most important thing for them is for somebody who's showed up, I mean, if you look at your life, pilot, captured, tortured, come back, Congress, Senate, running for president twice.
Whoops.
Yeah, well, no whoops. I mean, you did. And the key question is, what are the leadership lessons you've learned over that path?
The major leadership lesson that I've learned is to do the right thing. I have not always done the right thing. I, on several occasions, have done the political thing that would bring short-term political gain. That's not in keeping with the honor code of the United States Naval Academy.
Sometimes doing the political thing is the right thing.
Exactly.
Because, I mean, if there is one pillar that you've expressed for decades, it needs to be across the aisle. It needs to be bipartisan. You have to do the political thing. So how do you say, gee, I'm going to bend and compromise here, but not here? Where's that line?
The difference is principle. I can sit down across the table from any Democrat in the United States Senate, and I can make compromises to achieve a goal. But if you compromise your principle and your integrity in order to achieve a goal, that is obviously not an appropriate way for a senator to behave. And to keep those principles in mind, frankly, that I learned at the Naval Academy, are the differences, I think, in how history will judge you. I really do. At one time, I know we may talk about this later, but when I was in prison in Hanoi, they wanted to release me because my father was the admiral in charge of the all U.S. forces in the Pacific. It wasn't hard for me to say no. It wasn't hard because I knew that why they were going to release me and what that would do to my other fellow POWs, who they'd say, see, we sent the admiral's son home, but you're staying.
And did you have to think about that, at least count to 10, or was it an automatic?
I had to think about it a lot because at the time, my broken knee was there, my shoulders were broken, my health was not good. So I did weigh into it as to whether I thought I could survive or not. And then I finally came to the conclusion, if I did the wrong thing and survived, what was the point?
That summarizes it, doesn't it? These midshipmen are going to go out in the fleet or be pilots or submariners or go into the Marine Corps, and they're going into a world of peril. And as you look at it, with all your experience, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, what's the biggest national security threat to our country?
I think the biggest threat is probably Russia right now, but a threat to our national security is our failure to adequately fund and train and equip and have ready the young men and women we're putting out there on the front line. Bob, we are losing more men and women in the military in training than we are in combat.
I saw those statistics. Yeah, it's stunning.
Than we are in combat.
And the force is wearing out. Pilots in the Air Force, 40% of the planes can fly. Now, how can this rich country, with a Republican majority in the Congress, a Republican president, allow that to happen?
It's unconscionable because we are now having these accidents which are taking the lives of these young men and women. I called up the family members of the 10 who were killed in the USS John S. McCain, and it breaks your heart. You know what really breaks your heart, Bob, is how they take it, how proud they are of their sons that they served and sacrificed. It's deeply moving, and I feel that the guilt that we here in Congress must assume will be something that historians will look on as a embarrassing chapter in our history.
Well, it may be more than embarrassing. We may not be able to do the job of defending the country.
The cutbacks that we've had in defense spending caused the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the #1 military man in our whole hierarchy, to say the other day before the Armed Services Committee that if we don't change, that in 5 years our potential adversaries will have closed the gap between themselves and us. I don't want to send our young men and women into harm's way on an equal basis with our adversaries.
So how do you fix that? How do you break that gridlock and waive the whatever needs to be waived to get action?
Bob, I'm not going to bore you with the inner workings of the United States Senate, but what we have to do is say we're going to spend the money necessary that our military leaders are recommending. It isn't John McCain who's saying that. We're getting this from all of our leaders. And we're going to do what's necessary. And by the way, we're going to clean up our act. There's a whole lot of waste, mismanagement, cost overruns within the Department of Defense that is shameful. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fix the problem.
And in the, I did a story a couple of months ago about the Pentagon spending, and but the back office has grown bigger than the force.
We have fought it and fought it and fought it. We have made some significant changes and improvements, but I can tell you we've got a long, long way to go. Let me just give you one example. The latest aircraft carrier we have is the USS Gerald R. Ford. It was supposed to cost $10 billion. It ended up costing $12 billion. $2 billion just disappeared into the mist. We can't do that. We can't do that. And unfortunately, there's a number of other graphic examples of that as well. There is President Eisenhower, when he was retiring, as us old guys may know, gave a speech about the military-industrial complex. It is now the military-industrial congressional complex. And we're spending money on a small ship called a littoral combat ship. It has proven not to be what it was advertised to be, but we're still buying them, even though they're not working the way they were.
Can't the Armed Services Committee just say no?
Yes, we can, but then the appropriators, the money guys, add the money on. But we have cut back on it, don't worry. It's like we make progress, but it's slow and it's incremental. Because look, we're talking about doing battle with huge bureaucracies. I mean, huge bureaucracies who are tied to the manufacturers, the 5 major defense industries that control about 90% of the money.
One of the intelligence people told me some time ago, there are 20 countries in the world where the fuse of instability is lit. And I mentioned it to some other intelligence person who has this global perspective who said 20, that's a low number. Is that right? Are there that many hot spots that could just blow up, or we would have instability, a need to react?
I don't know the number. I do know this, that after World War II, there was a new world order set up with some greatest minds in the world, people like General Marshall and so many others that Vandergrift, so many others. They put together this world order, European-U.S. alliance, we called it NATO, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that led to the greatest period of peace and prosperity in the history of the world. Guess what is breaking down as we speak? You look at it from human rights, you look at it from the Muslim treatment of Muslims, you look at it from consolidation of power in countries like Hungary that are betraying I could go on the list. We are now seeing a breakdown of that new world order.
Does President Trump get this and understand the instability and the threats to our national security?
I don't know, but I know that the people around him are as good as and better than any. Mattis, McMaster, Kelly, they are outstanding. Question is, does he listen to them? I think sometimes he does. I've heard that sometimes he does not. When the Syrians used chemical weapons some months ago, the President of the United States struck back. That was the right thing to do, something we hadn't done in 8 years. He did that on the recommendation of these national security team. So I believe that he is listening to them. But sometimes when I see him say something that is just bizarre, what I've taken is the attitude of, I really, to a large degree, disregard what he says. To me, it's what he does. He is committed to rebuilding the military. He did react on Syria. We're going to do some more work in Afghanistan, finally with a strategy. So there are a number of good things that this administration is doing.
Now, North Korea obviously is a serious problem, and my reporting on it suggests there are kind of two camps in Washington. There's the peace camp and there is the war camp, and there is a war fever in this country, in this nation's capital. Do you feel it, of kind of building of this aura of we need action, we can't be pushed around?
There is some legitimacy to that view, because 3 administrations in a row have negotiated with the North Koreans and gotten nothing to show for it. How many times in the past few years you say, well, okay, the problem's over, the North Koreans have promised, et cetera, and it obviously hasn't happened. But on the other hand, there are 1,000 or so rockets and artillery that are in range of Seoul, a city of 27 million people. We could stop them once they fired, but the death and destruction that could be inflicted is incredible. So I think that we have to be firm, but it's obviously that China is a major factor. But at the same time, Kim Jong-un has to understand, not through speeches at rallies, but he has to understand that if he continues on this path, he's done. He has to understand that.
But, I mean, as you know war, and the people who've been in the military become the reluctant warriors,
yep.
The ones saying, okay, yes, we're willing to fight, but it's the last option. And this peace camp and this war camp, there is a third way, which is the diplomatic track. And I tell you, there's some people who are trying to get President Trump to send a letter to Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, and essentially say, look, Trump saying, I'm new to this, there's a long history, let's sit down and talk. If President Trump asked you to carry that letter for him to Kim Jong-un, would you do it?
I would do it with the following paragraph added on. If you don't choose to sit down and negotiate with us and rid all of Southeast Asia from this threat of nuclear warfare, then I promise you that there will be a very heavy price to pay. In other words, I'd put a little incentive in there.
Well, the incentive is out there because the president has made it clear he'll destroy.
But how much credibility does that have right now?
Well, that's, of course, the question. And the experts, the intel experts, ask this question. I'm sorry to press on this, but say you have to understand or ask what Kim Jong-un wants. And one of the answers that some of them has come up with is respect, engagement, normalization, not war. He doesn't want to destroy his country. He knows the peril he puts his country in. So if there's any chance he wants that, could somebody like you, a letter to the president, say, let's start talking? Because as we know in history, when the talking stops, the bullets start flying.
I totally agree with you, with one exception, and that is that every intelligence person that I talk to says that Kim Jong-un believes that he must have this nuclear capability. He looks at Libya, he looks at Ukraine, he looks at these other countries that agreed to get rid of their nuclear inventory and then ended up dead or out of power. So if you're looking at it from his viewpoint, look, these other people agreed to give up their nuclear weapons, and look what happened to them. It's going to be a very high price to pay for him to agree to stop his activities.
But he's now got nuclear weapons, and perhaps the
capacity
to...
So did Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And they bargained them away. Now, what's the Ukraine now? Part of Russia.
Yes.
So...
invaded. Yes.
So I think you'd have to convince him that we would somehow have guarantees to his survival. And that is an odious option. Who wants to see a guy who blows up his uncle with an anti-aircraft gun remain in power? So this may be one of the greatest challenges that the United States of America and the world has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Or maybe even since World War II, because the magnitude of the catastrophe that could come. Now,
and Khrushchev was not crazy.
Yes, and there's a debate in the intelligence community, is Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, crazy? And some people say, look, he may be acting that way, he wants to survive at all costs, and maybe there are buttons on his console that somebody can say, well, let's look at the alternative. Because giving up nuclear weapons isn't going to be the first stage of this. It's got to be some sort of diplomacy. At least that's what people tell me, but I'm asking you.
And I don't disagree, except for the fact that it is a very weak economy. The nuclear weapons is really their only... Would we be paying attention to North Korea if it wasn't for the issue of nuclear weapons? I don't think so. So that is his whole card. And for us to think that he's going to bargain that away in exchange for almost anything is not true. Finally, I believe that the Chinese still, it's in their interest not to see a nuclear confrontation.
Well, of course, it's in everyone's interest, but yeah. People tell me that Kim Jong-un wants to deal with the U.S., not China. They've been dealing with China for too long, and they look at Trump, you know, he's the commander-in-chief, he can employ the force as he sees fit, and I just wonder, you know, the Bushes, both senior and junior, went to war in Iraq, but if you look at the history of this, before the war, they both made the last effort to try to negotiate it away. George Bush Sr. sent Jim Baker to Geneva to meet with Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister for Saddam, and spent 6.5 hours with him and tried to, and you know, there was no give. Okay, there was a war as a result, but I wonder whether, just because people tell me this is, you know, the Washington, D.C. is vibrating with this issue.
It's vibrating, and I don't disagree with anything you've said, but I would argue that this issue is directly related to the perception of American weakness and how in every part of the world we're on the retreat, whether it be in Iraq, whether it be in Syria, whether it be the Pacific Islands.
Who's responsible for that weakness, Senator?
I think it's been going on for about 8 or 9 years.
And it's President Obama. I remember having a breakfast with one of our allied leaders, one of the big ones, and I said, what do you think of Obama? And he said, oh, I like him, he's so smart, but no one's afraid of him.
That's the point. That's exactly the point that I get from these people. And when he gives a speech that says, we're going to go into Afghanistan and we're going to do what's necessary and we're adding X thousand troops, but by the way, we're leaving on a date certain.
This is what Obama did in 2009.
Yeah, he gave a speech at West Point and announced to our enemy when we were leaving. You can't do that. Look, I have great respect for President Obama. He and I always have had a personal relationship that's cordial. But the way that this whole issue was handled,
concluded he just doesn't like war. And he so doesn't like war, he was willing to send that message to the Putins of the world, the Assads of the world. And, you know, it's with sadness you have to reach this conclusion. They kind of rolled over him.
When Bashar Assad violated the chemical weapons red line, the president called me and Lindsey Graham over to the White House. We sat there, Susan Rice was in the room, and he said, that's it. He said, they've crossed the red line. I'm going to train the Free Syrian Army. I'm going to degrade Bashar Assad and capabilities, and we're going to end this thing. Lindsey Graham and I went out. Hey, we're with the president all the way. We're going to get this done. About 4 days later, I have television on in my office, and announcement, the president is going to go to the Congress to get permission to, or agreement. The whole thing.
Which he didn't need.
Yes, which he did not need.
He was commander-in-chief. Yeah, he can do it.
He did not need it, and the signal that was sent. So suppose he went to Congress and it succeeded. You're an observer of this town. How many weeks or months would that take? Debate, committees, you know, all that stuff. So it was perceived accurately by Bashar Assad and the Russians and the others as a back down. He backed down. He
did. Now, Ken Burns' documentary, 18 parts on Vietnam, that he worked on for 10 years, is out. And one of the questions roiling around is, what are the lessons of Vietnam? No one probably has extracted more lessons from Vietnam than you.
When I came back from prison, the one thing I wanted to do was know how the hell I got where I ended up. So I went back through the history of it. The lessons that I have learned from it is that we always sort of thought we could succeed by half measures. In other words, the story is that in the basement of the White House was a list of targets, and each one of them had to be approved of to be struck by the President of the United States. That's no way to run a conflict. And of course, gradual escalation. Okay, hit these targets, and then maybe they'll come to the bargaining table. Oh, they didn't come to the bargaining table? Well, let's go up to Haiphong. They didn't come to the bargaining table? I mean, you got to go in, and finally, Christmas, as you know, of 1972, the B-52s came over, and the negotiations continued.
But still, we lost that war for all practical purposes.
Yes. By the time we did the right thing, the wrong thing had been done too many times. Too many times, and we paid a very heavy price for it. One of the great things about Ken Burns' piece on Vietnam is you get the Vietnamese perspective in that as well. Their thinking was very interesting. And where we were going back and forth and anti-war demonstrations and all that, they were steel. They were steel.
They really, and actually the bombing energized them and made them more unified in their resistance.
And they had, until he was eased out, one of the great generals in history, in Vo Nguyen Giap, the guy who won the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and of course he got mixed up in their politics, but they had one purpose. They were willing to die for it, and they understood it. The South Vietnamese, corruption, unfortunate attitudes and behavior which turned off the population of the South.
It tends to suggest that if you're going to become president and commander-in-chief, you should have some experience in the military. Is that right? I mean, obviously it's an advantage. Is it a requirement? Should it be?
No, and I think I think you should listen to the military. What was one of our greatest leaders in the history of the country? A guy named Abe Lincoln. You know, I mean, some of the great leaders have not had military experience, but they've had military people they trust. I know I'm spinning way off here.
No, you're not. This
is
exactly these midshipmen, the people. Okay. This, you know, this is on our plate right now. How are we going to make ourselves strong, and then act that way, and not let somebody push us around, but not get in, as Obama said, a stupid war?
If you look at pictures of Franklin Delano Roosevelt at Yalta, at Potsdam, at these gatherings of the world leaders, you'll see one guy standing there. You know who it is? It's a guy named George Catlin Marshall, General Marshall, who was the originator of the Marshall Plan following World War II. He trusted Marshall. Marshall didn't have that great, vast military, Roosevelt didn't have that great military experience, but he trusted people that he had the unique ability of selecting talent.
Last question, Senator, about because this gets filtered by my business, the news media, and how are midshipmen or citizens going to deal with the kind of hysterical hyperbole that seems to drive my business? Breaking news, we can tell you now, you know, cat's in the tree, breaking news, cat's out of the tree. How do we get a handle on that?
I think that to my young friends in the Brigade of Midshipmen, you are truly blessed because you are exposed to the honor and integrity and courage of centuries of people who have served this country in the United States Navy. Just a casual walk around the yard, as we say, and you'll see the names that really were the major factors, the leaders that were the major factors in making America the great nation called in the last century called the American century. And if I could, if you would indulge me, my young friends, I've been around a long, long time. I've made more mistakes than most anybody you will ever know. But one thing has guided me is what I learned the first day I walked through the main gate at the Naval Academy, and that was do the right thing and do it honorably, and you can never go wrong. I wish I could tell you that I have been true to that all the time.
But you've learned the lessons and you've traveled the road of introspection, which is the road we all have to travel.
And the greatest honor of my life was to have served in the company of American heroes. I have been so blessed in my life to known people like Jim Stockdale and Robinson Reisner and all of these great leaders that inspired me to do things that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to do so. So my friends, the next time you're walking around the yard and you see one of these names, I wonder who that was, look them up. They were important for us to be able to have the lives we have today, and don't let them down.